Strait of Malacca, 1948. The wireless operator on a ship is referred to, good-naturedly, as Sparks. The nickname Sparks was a byproduct from the early days of wireless communication on ships, when wireless sets would produce a train of high-voltage sparks which created the radio waves messages were sent on. Though the technology had improved in the roughly 4 decades of its use on ships, the name hadn't fully fizzled out just yet. Many crews still called the wireless operators on their ships the nickname. Sparks on the United States vessel Silver Star was a young man, sitting at his desk and writing reports. The headset Sparks wore was filled with the indiscriminate buzzing of various Morse code messages, which he was only half paying attention to. Most were merely distant messages not meant for him that he was intercepting. From ships out in the Gulf of Thailand, or the Andaman Sea, or even as far away as the Bay of Bengal, sending messages back and forth to the other, along with chatter from a few international listening stations set up around the region. Most of the ships were local to the region, though there were several US and other Allied ships in the region too, and there had been since the end of World War II 3 years earlier. The Sparks in this ship, the Silver Star, enjoyed the nickname, and only ever went by it while on board. He was a young man who had joined the United States Navy in the last year of World War II. Following the war, he was shifted around from ship to ship for a few years before being assigned to the Silver Star earlier in the year. His cabin on the Silver Star was small, barely enough room for both his bunk, desk, and a place for his clothes, but he found it cozy. The small room had no windows and was illuminated by the ceiling lights. The small crew of the Silver Star were tight-knit and had taken him in with open arms, though there was some good-natured picking made at him by the veterans of the ship. Such things were usual for any new arrival on a ship to expect, though. But the Silver Star captain made sure nothing became too extreme. He was one of the best captains Sparks had ever served under, a tough man with a gruff attitude, but fair, and he cared for the well-being of his crew while also demanding a tight ship be run. At the current moment, Sparks didn't have any major duties to perform, so he was filling out some paperwork while sitting at the desk in his cabin. Next to him was the wireless set. It was on, and he had the headset over his ears. He wasn't paying particular attention to the messages buzzing through the driver, only enough to know if anything was important or meant for him. He'd only just finished one of the many reports he had to fill out and was setting it aside on his desk when he heard a new message suddenly blare through his headset. It was so loud in his ears compared to the other distant messages that Sparks jerked in surprise and lifted one of the driver units off his ears as the sound blared loudly out of them. Sparks huffed in annoyance and listened to the dots and dashes from the new ship, waiting for the message to pass. His face slowly began to turn from annoyance to concern, and then to alarm. Once it set in what he was hearing, he dropped what he was doing, put the headset back on over his ears, and grabbed a pad of paper and a pencil, and rushed to write the message down. The message was an SOS, and Sparks hurried to write it down as it continued to blast loudly into his ears. The ship sending it must have been close by for the buzzing to be as loud as it was. At first, it appeared to be a normal distress call, but then it turned sinister, and he paused his writing. "What the hell?" he muttered. For a moment, he sat still and listened, as the message described a horrifying scene, his alarm only growing, before he snapped out of his surprise and continued to quickly write the message down. It abruptly changed from a clear message to a mess of Morse code which made no sense. The dots and dashes were all confused nonsense, and Sparks was about to try sending a reply when the message suddenly became intelligible Morse code again, and Sparks swore he felt his own blood turn icy at the chilling words which came through the headset next. Once the message concluded, he sat his pencil down, ripped the paper he'd written the message down on off its pad, and hastily sent back a reply to the distressed ship. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star. We hear your SOS." He was about to rush to the bridge, standing up and taking several steps towards his cabin door, when he paused, hurried back to the wireless set, and sent back an additional reply. "Stand by." With that, Sparks flew from his chair, tore his door open, and bolted from the cabin and up to the bridge. When a ship was in distress, there was no time to waste, and the message Sparks had just heard implied the Ourang Medan was in a very bad way. The officers and crew on the bridge barely had time to register his frantic footsteps slamming on the deck outside before Sparks all but flew into the room. "Captain, sir, a distress call has just come through," he panted. Who from, Sparks? The captain of the Silver Star asked. The Ourang Medan! Sparks gasped. The who? The captain replied. Wordless, Sparks held his slip of paper out, and the captain snatched it. He read the message silently, and then turned to look at Sparks again. Is this a joke, Sparks? He asked. Captain Ernest Hazley was a gruff man, and didn't take kindly to practical jokes on his ship. He commanded professionalism from his crew and expected their best. He had no patience for jokes of an inappropriate nature, which he felt the message he was holding in his hand might very well have been. No, sir, Sparks insisted, and Hazley eyed him, looking unconvinced. What does it say, sir? Hazley's first officer, Adam Hanley, asked. Looking at the bridge crew, who were standing at attention around him, Hazley began to read the SOS aloud. SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge. Probably whole of crew dead. Then Sparks wrote that the next part of the message was just a confused mess of dots and dashes that made no sense. He paused. Then, these last two words are all that came through? He asked, eyeing Sparks again. Sparks nodded, so the Silver Star captain read the final two words of the message to the rest of the crew. I die. Silence fell over the bridge, save for the humming of the ship's engines below them, and everyone felt a chill pass through them. Hazley sighed and handed the message back to Sparks. There was nothing about any location, he asked. Sparks shook his head, and the captain nodded. Sparks, go back below and see if anyone else heard this, Hazley ordered. Sparks saluted. Yes, sir, he gasped and bolted from the bridge and back to his cabin. Hazley watched him go, then looked outside at the vessel City of Baltimore, who was steaming alongside the Silver Star. It was the only other ship in the immediate area as far as he was aware. He looked at his first officer. Signal the City of Baltimore, ask if they heard it. Hanley nodded and stepped outside and began visual communications to their fellow ship. Within moments, he had a reply and stepped back into the bridge. They heard it too, sir, he reported. They couldn't reach Sparks, so they were about to signal us and see if we heard it. The captain nodded. Tell them to stand by until we know more. Hanley stepped outside again to relay the new message. Hazley then went below and into the wireless room. Well, Sparks, did anyone else hear it? Sparks was in the middle of sending a new message. Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star. We've heard your SOS. Please respond. Ourang Medan, please respond, old man. We need your position. But he was only met with silence after each message. When Hazley entered the room, Sparks turned around in his chair to face him. Yes, sir. Several British and Dutch listening posts are confirming they heard it too, he reported. And a few other ships miles out in the Bay of Bengal and the Gulf of Thailand are asking about it too. Did any of them hear anything else from the Ourang Medan? Hazley asked. No, sir. There's been no further message from the ship, Sparks replied. I've been trying to get in contact again to get her position, but there's nothing. Okay. Keep trying. And see if those listening posts can triangulate a location, Hazley said, leaving the cabin and returning to the bridge. Sir, what are we doing? The helmsman asked once the captain was back on the bridge. Well, right now, there's nothing we can do, lad. We have no idea where this Ourang Medan might be. All we can do for now is wait for Sparks to come through on a location. Either the listening outposts will determine it, or the Ourang Medan will send another message with coordinates. For the next hour, the crew on the bridge waited with tension in the air, no one willing to break the silence. The Silver Star and City of Baltimore continued their set courses, both going at half speed ahead, remaining side by side and exchanging visual communications every 15 or so minutes. In his cabin, Sparks tapped his pencil on his desk in frustration, listening, as all the communications he now heard were discussing the ship, but no one had a location. The Dutch and British listening posts chatted back and forth constantly at first, working together to try and locate the point of origin for the SOS. However, they'd gone quiet for far too long in Sparks' opinion. Finally, one of the British listening posts came back after being silent for a long time and announced they'd worked with the other listening posts around the region and triangulated the message's origin to a rough location. They sent the closest approximation they'd managed to work out to everyone listening, and Sparks quickly wrote it down before he again bolted from the room and up to the Silver Star's bridge. He burst into the room gasping for breath and began speaking. The listening outposts were able to work together to triangulate the area the ship is in. Approximately, at any rate. Us and the city of Baltimore are the closest ones, sir, Sparks reported. The Ourang Medan's position should be somewhere around 8 degrees, 12 minutes, 25.707 seconds north, 96 degrees, 3 minutes, 36.2017 seconds east. They don't think it's quite right, but it's approximately right in the middle of the possible spots they worked out. Hazley went to his chart and began working to determine where the Ourang Medan would be in location compared to the Silver Star. That is at the end of the Strait of Malacca and right at the edge of the Andaman Sea. That is a whole lot of empty ocean, and since we only have an approximate location, she could be anywhere around there. He trailed off as he looked down at the map, tapping the desk with his finger lightly as he considered the next move. What do you want to do, sir? He heard Hanley ask. The Silver Star captain turned around and looked at his crew. Turn the ship around. Head west. I'll work out a more proper course in a minute, he said. We're the closest ship to her, aside from the city of Baltimore. Whatever happened, the Ourang Medan is obviously in some kind of distress. There is a very real possibility that a danger to human life is present. It's our duty to investigate and save anyone if we can. So step to it. Get the lifeboat swung out and prepare to receive survivors. I want to talk to the chief engineer, get him up here, and I want him to put all the steam he can give me, I don't care what he has to cut off to get it, into the engine so we can go fast. Put all routine work on pause and get the ship's medical officer up here too. He then turned to Sparks. Tell the city of Baltimore's captain to have him hold their course. We're going to break off and head for the Ourang Medan. Until we know exactly what we're getting into, there's no need for us both to charge in blindly into a potentially dangerous situation. Sparks left the bridge as the officers and crew scrambled to complete Hazley's orders. Captain Hazley worked out the new course for the Silver Star in a matter of minutes, almost dead northwest from the Silver Star's current position. Pushing the ship to the fastest speed she'd ever mustered, he remained on the bridge as she veered off from the city of Baltimore and towards the empty horizon. It would take a few hours to reach the rough area the Ourang Medan should be in, and Hazley remained on the bridge for the entirety of the voyage, scanning the horizon for any signs of the ship. It was well into the afternoon before a speck finally materialized over the horizon. A tiny black dot which stood out against the clear blue sky and the deep blue water. She's about 10 miles out, Hanley reported, raising some binoculars to his eyes. Hazley looked out the forward-facing windows and then at his mate. What do you see? It's a ship, but I don't know if it's ours. Someone else could have been closer to the Medan and decided to do what we're doing. He handed the binoculars to Hazley, who raised them up to his own eyes. There's no smoke coming out of her smokestack. The message said, "We float," not "we're sailing." I think that might be her. Helmsman, adjust your course by 2 degrees to port, maintain full speed. We're heading in close. The Silver Star closed the distance, dashing ahead at full speed. Finally, when they were only around 1.5 miles out from the ship, did Hazley order the speed of the ship to be reduced to half. And then, when they were 3/4 of a mile out, he ordered it to be reduced to slow ahead. Slowly, the Silver Star came closer to the drifting vessel. It was drifting. There was no power moving her. By then, most of the crew had gathered on the top deck to look at the mystery ship they'd come so far to find. She was still and silent, and as the Silver Star drew closer, there was no sound or greeting issuing out from the ship. Hazley ordered his ship closer to look for anything to determine the identity of the drifting ship, wanting to know if it was the right one or just an abandoned derelict they'd happened upon by chance. The ship was not new. Her hull was clearly weathered. The freighter seemed to be at least a decade old, if not getting close to 2. No smoke was rising from her lone smokestack. If all was well aboard her, smoke should have been belching out and she would have been underway instead of drifting. There were no lights on in any of the windows. In fact, all the windows on the ship were dark. There was a mast at the forward and aft end of the ship, and a third just forward of her smokestack, which jutted out from her center. The ship's lifeboats were all swung out and ready to be loaded and lowered, but there was no one on deck waiting to board them, or crew waiting to lower them. The Silver Star moved in closer, and Hazley spotted something on the freighter's bow. On both sides of the drifting vessel's bow, though they could only see the starboard side one, was a teak nameplate which removed any doubt about the identity of the ship. The Silver Star came up along the starboard side of the ship, and the crew could easily read Ourang Medan in clear English text on the starboard side plaque. The name of the ship wasn't etched into her hull or even painted onto it, but was on a seemingly removable nameplate. The Silver Star crew hailed the vessel, but she remained silent, drifting forward in the current with waves splashing against her still hull. In his cabin, Sparks was trying to contact the ship, but he never got any response. It would be impossible to miss. If her wireless operator responded, it would be ear-splitting. Being so close to the mystery ship with no sign of anything outwardly being wrong made her silence unsettling. Captain Hazley stepped out of the Silver Star bridge with a megaphone and shouted, "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star responding to your SOS signal. Please respond." The ship remained still and eerily offered no response. The Silver Star crew had all fallen silent as well, and the only sound was the ocean waves and the whispers of the wind. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star responding to your SOS signal. Please respond." Captain Hazley tried again, but there was no response. He sighed deeply and lowered the megaphone. "All right, we can't wait. Something is clearly wrong." He turned to Hanley. "We're going aboard. Get volunteers for a search party. I want at least a dozen men." "Yes, sir," the mate responded, hurrying out of the bridge and down to the forward deck of the Silver Star. Hazley also left the bridge a moment later. The door to the Silver Star's wireless room opened, and Hazley stepped inside. "Well, Sparks?" he asked. Sparks turned around in his seat and stood up. "Yes, sir?" "Has she sent anything over the wireless?" Hazley asked. Sparks shook his head. "No, sir," he said. "I'm taking a search party aboard. Tell everyone else listening to stand by," Hazley replied, nodding to the wireless operator and then leaving the room again. Sparks adjusted his headset and sat back down at his desk, sending out the message over the telegraph. It didn't take long for a boarding party of more than a dozen to be assembled on the deck, with Captain Hazley approving each volunteer. Aside from the captain, First Officer Hanley, Second Officer Walsh, and Fourth Officer Miles, 19 other Silver Star crew members would make up the boarding party. Third Officer Johnston was being left in command of the Silver Star until Captain Hazley's return. Of the Silver Star crew members going aboard the Ourang Medan, one was the ship's photographer, a young man named Jimmy Weddle. Captain Hazley wanted to be first aboard the Medan, but his first officer stepped in his way. "Until we know what's going on over there, perhaps it's best if I go first." "You're more important, sir," he said. Hazley, knowing he couldn't argue with his first mate, simply nodded after a moment and allowed the officer to board the Medan first. The silent freighter loomed alongside the smaller Silver Star as the boarding party and crew alike made final preparations to board the vessel. Finally, as everyone watched with bated breath, Hanley boarded the ship alone. As he climbed up onto her deck, he looked around and paused. "Oh my God," he whispered as he took in the sight in front of him. After a moment, he turned around and waved to the others. "Come on over," he called. Everyone could see he was shaken by something, and this time, Hazley would not be put off. He followed second, and he, along with everyone else in the boarding party, saw what had shaken Hanley so deeply. Across the deck were strewn bodies, the bodies of the Ourang Medan crew. Most were lying on their backs, but some laid on their faces or rested slumped against railings or walls. A dog was sprawled on its belly near one wall as well. Those on their backs gazed up at the sky with blank expressions, their eyes glassy and dead, and holding no spark of life. And their skin was turning gray and black as it decomposed. But there was no reek of death that one should expect from the bodies being in the state they were in. It was as if they'd been dead for days or weeks, but it didn't smell like it. There were no signs of injury or causes of death on the deceased crew. The bodies looked untouched, and it was as if everyone had just dropped dead. "What the hell?" someone behind Hazley asked. Watch where you step, Heasley eventually said. Don't hit them. Look around for any survivors, but stay on deck. Miles, make sure everyone keeps their heads on their shoulders. Hanley, Walsh, and you two, he said, pointing to the last two Silver Star crew members to board the Medan. You come with me to the bridge. Let's see if we can find the log. As the crew began checking to see if anyone lying among the bodies was still alive, the small group headed up to the bridge. Hanley led the way up a staircase which led to the bridge and opened the door. The walls inside were made of dark brown wood. At the front of the room, by the large windows, was the wheel and some navigation tools. Behind them was a counter, and at the back of the bridge was a wall filled with various controls, such as the watertight door control system, and communication equipment for talking directly to the engine room crew. There were 2 doors on the back wall and a locker, which was shut and had a lock on the door. There were some papers lying on the counter, but none gave any clues about the ship or her destination, and there was no logbook visible. There were no bodies on the bridge, and Hanley fiddled with the padlock on the locker, but he couldn't get it unlatched. You two, he said, turning around and pointing at the 2 crewmen who accompanied him and the officers to the bridge. See if you can get this open. Maybe the logbooks are in here, he said. They nodded, and one said, sure, then tapped his fellow on the arm. Let's see if there's a key or maybe something we can cut the lock with in one of those back rooms. They went to one of the closed doors at the back of the bridge and opened it. As they did, Heasley turned around to his first and second officers. Walsh, help the others on deck. Hanley, we're going to find the wireless operator. The wireless operator, who had been sending messages only hours prior, was in the same state as everyone else on the Ourang Medan. He was visibly decomposing, looking like he'd been dead for a week in the heat. Yet, he'd been alive hours earlier. His hand still grasped the wireless telegraph transmitter knob, like he'd died right after sending the words, I die. As if he'd known whatever killed everyone was coming for him, while he was all alone on board the derelict. Dried drool had dripped out of his mouth and pooled around his head, which had fallen onto the desk face first. His body was slumped like he'd slowly slipped down into that position. He still wore his headset as well. The wireless set itself was out of power, and any attempt to reactivate it by Heasley and Hanley had failed. The door to the room had been left open. Captain, Hanley muttered, clearly disturbed and maybe even slightly frightened, though he didn't show this. Heasley was sympathetic, but needed his first officer at his best right now. I know. Look, Hanley, I want you to round up some men and head below. See if there's anyone alive below deck. If you don't find anyone, come back up top. See if you can get the lights on, Hanley said, motioning to a power box on the wall with a flashlight he'd brought from the Silver Star. A crewman from the party nodded and opened the box, flipping some of the switches inside, but the passageway remained dark. Clearly they won't turn on because there is no power, he muttered to himself, closing the box again. Hanley had rounded up a group of 5 men to accompany him below decks into the interior of the ship. They descended down a stairwell and come out in a tight, empty passageway within the interior of the ship, so it had no windows to let outside light in. They'd quickly realized that, yes indeed, the Ourang Medan was dark on the inside, like they'd thought when they'd seen no lights on inner windows when approaching on the Silver Star. They'd gone down a few decks and seen no bodies, but the passageways being empty did not help anyone feel any less at ease, especially with the ship being dark and silent on the inside. No one had the nerve to peek into any of the open doorways, not even Hanley, who had the only flashlight. As they made to walk down the passage, the small group stopped when the sound of groaning, strained metal sounded through the passageway. The Ourang Medan groaned loudly around the group for several moments, a loud banging echoing through the corridor, before she went silent again. Why would she be making that sound? Another crewman asked. Hanley shook his head. Maybe she's taking on water. Let's go down to the engine room to look. You, head back out on deck and tell the captain we're going below to see if she has any damage. He'll want to know if she's taking on water, he said to a young deckhand from the Silver Star, who nodded and hurried back down the corridor, vanishing from sight quickly. They heard the door to the stairwell open and close after a few seconds, and faint steps hurrying back up the dark metal steps. They faded quickly, and the silence resumed, save for the shuffling of the small team's bodies as they shuffled in place. One man, who was standing with his back to a dark open doorway, couldn't handle the void being right behind him, and he spun around, grabbed the knob, and pulled the door shut. Hanley turned and pointed the light at him, and he suddenly appeared sheepish in the beam of light, but Hanley had felt just as uncomfortable and merely nodded. After a moment, the rest of the search party proceeded down the corridor and descended the first set of stairs they came to. Upon arriving at the lower levels of the ship and entering the engine room, the stairwell ended in it by happy chance. One Silver Star crew member shivered and gasped. "It's cold," he said. The air, the floor, and metal walls were all chilly. Hanley nodded, realizing he could see his breath in the beam of his flashlight. He slowly panned it around the dark room. Other than his light casting a bright spot wherever he pointed it, the rest of the room was dimly illuminated in a few locations by still dimly burning lanterns, which seemed on the verge of burning out. One was sitting on a desk, one was hanging from a peg, one was hanging from a boiler hatch, and they cast dim yellow lights into the space around them, revealing that there were more bodies in this area of the ship before Hanley found them with his flashlight. The bodies of the engine room crew were slumped all around, decaying visibly like the ones on deck had been. Despite the coolness of the space, they also looked like they'd been dead for at least a week, if not more. In fact, the bodies seemed to be decaying so fast that by the time Hanley had returned to the deck from the wireless room, the bodies on deck had turned a more black and rotting fleshy color, looking like they'd been dead for several weeks. "That's not right," Hanley said, looking at the corpses before he lifted his light up and panned it around the room. "And this is why there's no power. The boilers are cold, and they have been for a while." While being so deep inside a ship felt like being within the vessel's belly, in truth, the engine room was more like the beating heart of a ship. If it stopped, the ship's heart was stopped. The Ourang Medan's heart had stopped and was icy cold. "Hours at least," another crew member said. "It takes hours for an engine room to cool off, let alone grow frigid. And look over there," he added, pointing at the far end of the room, at a doorway barely illuminated by one of the lanterns. "Watertight doors are closed." "Why would they close the doors? She's sitting level. She's not taking on water." "I don't know," Hanley replied, grabbing one of the lanterns and handing it to someone so they would have more light for the dark trip back up to the top. He then approached the closed watertight door and tapped it with his flashlight, and it rang out. "Yeah, there's no water in that compartment. It's not flooded on the other side of this," he said. "Do you want us to open it?" someone in the group asked. Hanley shook his head. "No, we don't know what's on the other side. A whole crew doesn't drop dead like this for no reason, unless they had some hazardous cargo on board, and there very well might be a cargo hold behind this door, and if that's the case, this door might be the only thing keeping us from it. What if something came out of the ocean? What if something came aboard? What if something not natural is here with us? What if they trapped it in there?" Hanley whipped around and pointed at the stubborn crew member. "Stop it," he ordered. He turned and placed his hand on the bulkhead and paused. "That's weird. The door is warm. It's not cold like everything else down here." He stared at the door for a moment and then knocked on it, thinking the only reason it might be warm was if someone was on the other side keeping the room behind it warm. There was no answering knock. Hanley paused for another moment before motioning to the stairwell with his light. "Let's head up top and get out of here." The rest of the group didn't need to be told twice. They were all more than ready to get out of the dark and chilly bowels of the Ourang Medan and back into the warm and bright sunlight. They made their way back up the stairs and through the dark corridors inside the guts of the derelict ship. As they did, Hanley couldn't help but keep thinking about that closed bulkhead and what it might mean. He didn't think there was a monster hiding in there, something having hidden itself away in a dark place once it killed the crew, maybe already watching them and following them. His mind focused on more realistic reasons for what was behind the door, and why it was warm. That was what really was getting to him. Why was it warm? Returning to the warm sunlight and salty air did not come soon enough for those who had ventured down into the Ourang Medan's interiors and found only more death within her steel insides. Death in two ways, that being more confirmed human casualties, and that of the ship, because with her boilers cold and her engines shut down, she might as well have been as dead as her crew was. Hanley opened a doorway and stepped back out on deck, followed by the others. "Anything new?" he asked one of the Silver Star boarding party members who was leaning against one of the Medan's safety railings. The man shook his head, so Hanley asked, "Where's the captain?" The man turned and motioned towards another open door with his head. Hanley made for the door, but paused. "Hey, come here," he said, waving the man over. "Listen, take this," he said, handing the man his flashlight. "And see if you can find a way into the cargo holds and look around, will you? There was a closed watertight bulkhead down there. I was thinking at first that maybe they closed it to keep whatever happened here from spreading, but now I'm wondering if there's not someone alive who closed it to protect themselves from whatever happened here. The ship was cold down there, but the door was warm, so the room behind it has to be. It would only be warm if someone was keeping it warm. If anyone is alive, cargo hold is a likely place they'd be hiding, so just go have a look." As he was giving this order, Miles had come out of the doorway in the superstructure and waited for him to be done before speaking. "Just the man I was looking for. Captain sent me out here to see if anyone had seen you. He wanted you to come to the chart room if you were back on deck," he said. In the chart room, the Silver Star's captain was looking at the maps and navigation charts laid out on the table, but he wasn't getting too close due to the bodies slumped on and around the table. The SOS hadn't lied. The officers, some of them at least, and the captain were indeed all lying in the chart room. The room wasn't very large, but it had 4 dead bodies in it. 3 officers lying sprawled out on their backs on the floor, and 1 body slumped over the table with the navigation charts. The wooden walls were the same dark brown as the bridge, and they added an eerie sensation to the room, as the decaying bodies almost matched its color tones. Their skin wasn't just rotting, it was covered in seeping, bloody splotches and open wounds. It seemed like they had been trying to plot the quickest course back to land, and they all died. Like they were going to make a mad dash away from something, but died before they could make the attempt. "Where were they heading?" Hazley asked, mostly to himself, once he'd stepped into the chart room and looked at the scene. Wallace shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't touched anything. I don't really want to go through any of this, especially since he's melting on the charts," he said, looking down at the deceased man slumped over the navigation charts, who he assumed to be the Ourang Medan's captain. "Once I found the room, I thought you'd want to see it," he added. Hazley stared at the deceased captain lying in front of him and shook his head, squatting slightly to see what he could in the man's face, but the man was lying face down. "Bodies don't decay this fast naturally," he said. For a moment, none of the Silver Star crew gathered in the chart room, a few had followed Hazley into the room when he entered, spoke. During the silence was when Hanley stepped into the room, and while just outside he'd overheard the last part of the conversation before the silence fell. "Sir, what are we going to do?" he asked after a moment when it was clear no one had any idea what they should say. And what was there really to say about the situation they'd come across? It defied all logic. Hazley looked at Hanley next and asked, "What'd you find below? Anyone alive?" Hanley shook his head. "Just more bodies in the engine room. Boilers were cold too, and seems like they've been that way for a while. The whole room was cold. Oh, and there was a closed watertight bulkhead down there. It was warm. Thought at first they might have closed it to stop whatever happened here from happening, but then I thought maybe someone might have closed it themselves to hide behind it. If I had to pick a place where we'd find survivors, it'd probably be one of the holds. That room wouldn't be warm for no reason." Hazley paused for a moment, considering what he wanted to do and if he wanted to launch any more searches into the interior of the ship after everything he'd seen so far. Then he finally came to a decision and said, "I want everyone to stop what they're doing. Don't touch anything. I don't know what happened here, but we are in over our heads on this. This needs to be investigated, and we're not equipped or qualified for it. We're going to rig up the tow line and tow the ship into port. We'll let experts look it over. And if anyone actually is alive, they'll be found then. He turned to face Hanley. Get the word out. I want everyone back on deck, and I don't want anyone to touch anything. Hanley nodded and left through the same door he came through and headed back out into the passageway. Hazley then turned to one of the youngest men who'd come aboard. Jimmy, I want you to document everything as it is in its current state, in case anything gets disturbed while we tow her into port. Put that camera to use. Start with our friend in the wireless room. Jimmy nodded, then left, and Hazley turned to look at Miles. Where is everyone? He wanted his people spread across as little of the ship as possible. Almost everyone is on deck, as you ordered, save the two lads on the bridge you told to break open that locked locker and see if the ship's logbooks were inside, and one man who Hanley sent below to the cargo holds before he came in here, Miles replied. Why do you send someone down there for? Hazley demanded. Like he said, he sent the lad to check see if any survivors were down there. If anyone is left and hiding somewhere on board, that'd be the first place I'd look too, Miles said. Especially if a watertight door was closed. That might protect them from whatever happened. And he's right. That room wouldn't be warm for no reason. I think that was one more thing worth investigating before we tow her in. Hazley huffed but didn't argue. Instead, he walked out of the chart room as well. He stepped back out on deck and looked around at the dead crew and then at the Ourang Medan. What happened to you, old girl? What happened to your crew? He asked, wishing the ship could answer. Second Officer Walsh headed out of the chart room and walked to the Medan's starboard side railing at about amidships and shouted down to the Silver Star, Captain says get the tow line rigged! He wants to tow her in! Johnston, who was standing at the door to the Silver Star's pilot house, nodded and quickly saluted to show he'd heard. On the forward deck, men rushed to prepare a line. The men worked quickly on both ships, and it seemed everyone wanted the adventure to be over as soon as possible, and it took only a few minutes to get the line rigged. Silver Star's stern was lashed to the Ourang Medan's bow, and Hazley's plan was for a few of his men to remain on board while the Silver Star towed the derelict back into port. Those who'd remain on board, including Hanley, were under strict orders to not touch anything or move any of the bodies. Hazley wanted the scene left as undisturbed as possible for the experts to examine. Just as the Silver Star crew were wrapping up the salvage operation preparations and were about to return to their own ship, a door suddenly burst open and a lone Silver Star crew member, the one Hanley sent below, bolted out on deck. Captain, he gasped. What? Hazley said. Gasping for air, looking as if he'd run up every stairwell on the ship, the man sped out, There's a raging fire in cargo hold number 4. Hazley looked at Hanley for a moment before he turned his gaze back to the gasping man and ordered, Show me. Leading the way back down, the frightened Silver Star crew member led Hazley and a few others down to the cargo hold and opened a hatch which led out onto a catwalk above it. Below, an inferno was raging, the heat so intense they'd felt it before the door was even opened. Smoke gushed out from the flames, and an intense orange glow was consuming the few remaining crates in the hold. A doorway was open below. The flames had already spread through it and into the next room. Hazley didn't have to be told that they didn't have the equipment to put out such a blaze, and if there was any on board, he doubted it, there wasn't time to find it. The Ourang Medan was doomed. The heat was already so intense in the room, from whatever was inside the burning crates, that he feared the coal stores in the boiler room might ignite from it at any time. For the fire to be raging to such an out-of-control extent, Hazley realized the blaze must have been burning since before they arrived. He guessed it had been smoldering or burning slowly, and something had caused it to suddenly ignite and intensify. Maybe a door opening somewhere on the ship had allowed smoke to escape, or allowed fresh oxygen to vent to it. Forget it, we can't put that out, he said, motioning everyone back out of the hatch they'd come in through only moments after they'd stepped inside the hold. Everyone out, get up on top and abandon ship. Back to the Silver Star, he ordered, pulling the hatch of the hold shut to stop the smoke, locking it as he pulled it closed. Pushing the others back out, they hurried back up through the passageway they'd come down, passing a lone fire axe mounted to the wall at the end of the passageway. For all the good it would have served at that moment, all the firefighting equipment on the Ourang Medan and Silver Star would do no good to fight the blaze. One of the Silver Star crew members couldn't help but chuckle as they passed the fire axe. All the good that'll do us now, right, Captain? He asked. Hazley shoved the man forward by his shoulder. Keep moving. The group hurried through a door at the end of the passage and up a set of stairs which led out onto the top deck. The ship let out a violent, shuddering groan as they ran up the stairs. By the time they were back out, smoke was already billowing out of the lower portholes in the bow section. "Everyone, evacuate back to the Silver Star! Fire below deck! Abandoned ship!" Hazley shouted. Everyone dropped what they were doing and rushed to obey, and Hazley urgently spoke to Hanley. "That closed bulkhead door was warm because the room behind it was on fire! It's completely out of control! Help make sure everyone gets back over to the Silver Star." Hazley then turned to Walsh. "Are those two still up on the bridge?" "Yes, sir," Walsh replied. "Go get them and tell them to get their asses off this ship. Now!" Hazley said in a calm tone but with a raised voice. Walsh nodded and ran for the steps which led up to the bridge, and Hazley turned to one of his crew, one of those who had gone with the group and seen the fire. "Is everyone else here?" "There's no one else below, but Jimmy's still in the wireless room." "Go get him!" Hazley ordered. The shaken crewman nodded and turned to sprint for the wireless room. He opened a door and sprinted past the open chart room door as he felt the Medan shudder below his feet. He was running so fast he had to reach out and use his arms to catch himself on the open wireless room door frame so he didn't slide past, and he pulled himself inside. Jimmy was in the process of taking pictures of the room. "Out on deck now. Captain's ordered everyone off the ship," the crewman gasped. When Jimmy didn't immediately turn around, he stepped further into the wireless room and shouted, "Come on, there's a fire below deck! Hazley wants everyone off the ship now!" Finally, Jimmy turned around. Okay, he said, whipping around and taking one additional photo, one of the dead wireless operator, before he turned and followed the other crewmen out of the room and back down the passage, fleeing the wireless room. Walsh reached the top of the stairs leading to the Ourang Medan's bridge, and through the open door he saw the two Silver Star crew members Hazley had left less than 20 minutes ago trying to pry open the locker with a crowbar. The locked door was finally starting to bend, though the lock was still holding, but Walsh didn't care at this point. "Forget it, boys. Captain's ordered everyone back to the Silver Star." "The captain told me to get into this locker. I've just about got through the lock." "Forget it. Hazley wants everyone off the ship now. Come on, there's a fire below deck. The ship is fucked. Hazley wants everyone back on the Silver Star now." Finally getting it, the two dropped the crowbar and ran for the bridge door. Walsh stood aside to let them pass, and then followed them back down the metal stairs. Once they reached the deck, they sprinted to where the Silver Star crew were leaving the doomed ship and heading back to their own, just as the other two sprinted out of the door and joined them. Hazley waited until everyone was off, even making sure 2 head counts were done to ensure no one was still aboard the Dutch freighter. If anyone had been, he would have gone to find them himself, before following them back to the Silver Star. Once he reached his ship, he hurried to her bridge and shouted, "Cut the tow line!" As one man hurried to do so, Hazley entered the bridge and shouted, "Set the engines to full speed ahead the second the tow line is cut. Get us away from this ship!" The moment the line was severed, the Silver Star helmsman, Ozzy, lunged forward and threw the ship's engine order telegraph to a head full after moving the handle to ring the engine room 3 times first. The props on the Silver Star spun to life quickly, and the Silver Star began to move, sliding over the water past the Ourang Medan, slow at first, but she quickly increased her speed. Hazley himself grabbed and turned the wheel hard over, and his ship veered to starboard and flew away from the freighter, leaving it behind them as he came about to head back in the direction they'd originally come from. Nearly everyone on the Silver Star gathered on the aft deck to watch the Ourang Medan as they pulled away and as she shrank behind them, no longer seeming so massive and imposing as she had on their approach. Smoke clouded around her, pouring from open doors and windows across the silent ship's forwardmost section like a gaseous blood. The Silver Star was only a few hundred feet away from the ship's stern when the Medan finally made a sound. There was a sudden blast which shook the ship. With a lurch, the bow slightly rose, or jumped, ever so slightly out of the water for a moment, which erupted around it at the same time as the blast in angry white splashing foam, before the bow settled back down into the sea, now with a visible and increasing forward list. Windows across the freighter were shattered apart by the blast, and the hull outside one of the holds was torn open as the explosion ripped apart the metal body of the Ourang Medan. Still billowing out smoke from open doors and shattered windows, the Ourang Medan began to settle further forward as her bow flooded with water. Even with her watertight bulkheads closed, it was clear the explosion had ripped open a hole in her hull too large for them to keep the water at bay. The holds were flooded, the engine room was filling, and many of the lower passageways in the bow section of the ship were completely filled with water up to their ceilings. She settled more by her bow and was sinking deeper by the head, faster and faster, fast enough to be visible to those observing. The Ourang Medan had fallen silent again following the explosion, and the Silver Star crew watched as the vessel continued to settle down ever more towards the bow. As her bow sank and settled deeper in the water, the ship's propellers began to, ever so slightly, poke out of the water's surface at the stern. She slipped deeper and deeper until, with a groan, she began rolling onto her side. There were faint crashes from inside as unbolted items fell and slid to the starboard side, and the Ourang Medan continued to roll over onto that side. As more of her submerged, the smoke around her lessened, and soon it mostly disappeared, leaving the Silver Star crew with a now unobstructed view of the sinking ship. There was a flash from the stern of the Silver Star. Jimmy, who had been able to take a few photos on board the derelict, had thought to capture one more as she rolled over. No one spoke. Everyone stood silent on the Silver Star, watching the ship as she sank. The Ourang Medan had rolled all the way onto her starboard side. She was almost lying sideways in the water, but not quite, and she was settling deeper into the water. She was still settling down by the head, but she seemed to be settling level again as the water flooded the entire ship at an equal rate through open and shattered windows rather than just the forward sections. She lost her forward list and rested even and level on her starboard side, rolling over what had to be a nearly 50-degree list. The strained groaning and creaking of the metal hull sounded like a creature in pain. Within the interior of the groaning ship, water was flooding passageways and slowly rising to the ceiling of each one, flowing into rooms and filling them and gushing down staircases. The dark passageways were slowly filled by the gurgling seawater as it continued to flow into the ship and flood her interiors. She began flooding fast, and she began to slip down faster. Only a few mere minutes after the explosion rocked her, the mysterious ship slipped below the waves and was gone. The port end of her stern was the last part of her to sink below the waves. She went down silently, just as she had been when the Silver Star crew found her. There were no rumbles or further explosions after she sank, just silence. Soon, the surface of the ocean, which had been left in a stirred-up mess of bubbles and foam after the ship sank, calmed, and the cloud of smoke she left in the air was blown away, and all traces of the Ourang Medan were gone. (2038) Strait of Malacca, Andaman Sea meeting point. Two unmanned submersibles crept along the ocean bottom, slowly working their way towards a large sonar-indicated target ahead. It was yet hidden by the gloom, which was only punctured by the lights they bore and shone out to create a bubble of illuminated water around them. They were surrounded by the intense pressure, only matched by the unfathomable darkness of the deep ocean. They bore the only lights in a void which looked like outer space if it had become devoid of stars. A darkness which could have hid anything, from a Goliath predator to a harmless small curious fish. Currents pushed against them, but the subs held their course that they were instructed to follow, towards the sonar-indicated target that slowly drew nearer, an anomaly which didn't belong and was soon to be showered by their lights. Above them, far above them, where the world was illuminated by the sun, a single research vessel was receiving the live video footage from the subs, showing the bottom of the ocean live in high definition. Leading the expedition was a marine archaeologist and historian, Brock Ballard, a man known for discovering a few shipwrecks around the world. Now he was searching the Strait of Malacca and Andaman Sea for any undocumented wrecks that were present in the region, leading a study being funded by several universities, private individuals, and historical societies to fill in some of the blank pages in history. Multiple ships had been sunk in the region during both world wars, but There had never been major expeditions to find some of them, so with the centennial of the start of World War II approaching, many had decided it was time to change that and ensure some of the lesser known parts of history were appropriately documented and preserved. That was the official reason anyway. Though everyone on board knew he was secretly searching for, or rather, hoping to come across, one wreck in particular now that he had a chance to actually search the region. The wreck of the legendary ghost ship, Ourang Medan, which, if it was real, should have been in the region if the few historical details on the story were accurate. You couldn't hope to mount an official expedition to look for the ship unless you had the money to fund it yourself, which Ballard didn't, because most thought she never existed, so no one would fund a hunt to try and find it. But Ballard had long been fascinated with the story, and a dream of his was to prove that the ship indeed did really exist. Most on board knew he'd be disappointed, but officially, the expedition was about to achieve its goal. It had been a success even if no further wrecks were located. They'd located a wreck on the ocean floor a day earlier and had sent 2 submersibles down that morning to document the wreck. It was undocumented and the exact kind of thing they'd been sent to find. Another piece of history had been found and would soon be added to the books once they were able to film and study it. They were now less than 50 meters from the wreck and closing the distance. Many of Brock's colleagues around the world were also aware of what he'd actually wanted to find in the region, but didn't voice their concerns. Brock Ballard, despite believing in the validity of a ghost ship which had never been found in a single registry, was a well-respected marine archaeologist and had been for more than 15 years. He'd not only discovered multiple wrecks thought lost forever, thanks to his nature to think outside of the box when searching for wrecks that no one else had found. He was also one of the few people to have actually seen the wreck of the RMS Titanic in person. In his over a decade of work as a marine archaeologist, he'd studied the famous wrecks like the Titanic, and he'd searched for several missing liners few people tended to remember, such as the Waratah, Hans Hentoft, Pacific, Lord Spencer, and many others. Often looking for ones that most historians didn't bother trying to find because those were the stories that deeply interested him. His reputation was more than enough to make up for his believing in a fictitious ship. Everyone could have a hobby, and everyone knew he would stay on task and not go out of his way and waste time and money trying to find it. Brock was staring, his gaze fixated at the screen as he waited for the wreck to materialize from the darkness, like a ship on the surface would eerily materialize out of the fog. The idea alone of it being the Ourang Medan was exciting, but he didn't let himself actually believe that was the ship that was ahead. He could entertain the notion for fun, but he knew that it wasn't what was waiting ahead and didn't let himself believe it. He might have believed in the story and thought that the ship did indeed exist, but her location would be near impossible to find. They'd been scanning the seafloor in the region for signs of undocumented shipwrecks due to a number of historically important ships going down in the region over the years. And at most, he hoped the wreck ahead was one of those. They had been given a list of targets which were the most desired to be found. If not one of those, it was still a wreck no one else had found, and that meant either way, the expedition was a success. And he was excited to see which one it ended up being. A cargo freighter? A warship? A POW transport? Something that vanished without a trace and was missing? Brock's assistant snorted from behind him. Look at this guy. He really thinks he's gonna find the Ourang Medan down there. Ballard looked at him over his shoulder and shrugged. Hey, I keep an open mind. The ship is a myth, the assistant continued. Brock again just shrugged his shoulders. Hey, maybe. But that is an undocumented shipwreck ahead of the submersible, so that's something. There's a lot of known ships it could be, and probably is. We are not sailing away empty-handed either way. Okay, fair enough, but come on. You know that won't be the Medan down there. Come on, people dying with their faces looking up at the sky with expressions of terror, an explosion so violent that it threw the ship out of the water. I'm sure some details were exaggerated with retellings, Ballard replied. The Medan doesn't exist! I never said this was the Ourang Medan, or that she did. It could be anything. I'm not arguing with you on that fact, but like I did say, I keep an open mind. Okay, pictures then. Why are there none? Cameras weren't exactly rare in the 1940s. You've been fascinated with the story for your whole life, so explain that one to me. Have you never questioned it? You've been itching to ask me this, haven't you? Okay, I'll play ball. You want to have a go at me? Let's dance, big boy. First, there actually is a supposed picture of her, showing the ship capsizing. I thought the ship blew up. Again, apparently it was so violent that it was thrown out of the water. Why would it be capsizing then in the picture? Well, like I just told you, I think some details were exaggerated over the years. If anything, I'd say the more likely scenario was a small explosion rocked the ship, probably tore open the hull, and she capsized from the flooding. You can't take those stories at face value, just like the Loch Ness Monster. Also, I know some of you are taking bets on if I'll try to actually find it. No. I'm a professional here, and it's not my money. As Ballard turned around, facing back toward the screen again and staring intently into the gloom ahead of the submersible, from which the ghostly-looking outline of a shipwreck should appear at any moment, he added, when his assistant went to open his mouth again, "Hey, you're also the one who brought her up, not me. I wasn't even going to mention her." The assistant closed his mouth begrudgingly. Some of Ballard's longtime friends and colleagues who were sitting at the back of the room chuckled under their breaths as the man shut his mouth. A voice then emanated from the team's radios, one of the operators controlling the two submersibles. "She's just under 6 meters out. You should see her in the lights any time now." Ballard stared intently at the screen as the subs crept closer to the wreck. "Thanks, Dave," he said into the radio he had with him. This was the moment, no matter how many times he visited a wreck, that made him hold his breath. Those final few moments before the ship appeared on the screen or out of the sub windows. Slowly, a tall structure came into view out of the gloom. The rusting hulk of a sunken ship sitting upright on the ocean floor. Once, she might have been beautiful in her own right, but now she was merely a shadow of what she'd once have been, and rusting long forgotten on the ocean floor with no light and no visitors. As soon as he saw it on the screen, Ballard went from joking to professional, as did everyone else. "Take her up and right over the front of the bow. Let's find out what we're looking at," Ballard ordered the pilot. The lead of the two subs crept away from the ocean floor and rose up and forward until it passed over the bow of the ship. Ballard stared intently at the computer screen broadcasting the live footage back to the research ship, taking in each detail of the wreck, looking for any clues that could give the ship her identity back. She might have once been a proud ship sailing across the untamable ocean, in a way as alive as any person. But now she was a ruin, a rusting wreck, the skeletal remains of what was once alive, forgotten on the seabed by those who lived on the surface far above, unvisited and unloved. That was how Brock always felt when he first saw a shipwreck, especially one he was the first to discover. They always looked sad, resting on the seafloor, their rusting image a mere shadow of what they once had been so many years, sometimes centuries before. Okay, let's see what we have here. Look for any identifying aspects, Brock said, his eyes still on the screen. Looking for traits which could be used to identify the type of ship, and the specific one, was a bit of a difficult task when the only lights were those from two unmanned subs, one passing over the forward deck while the other passed along the starboard side railing. The bow was slightly crumpled, indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first, before the rest landed and settled on the seabed. The safety rails on each side of the bow were as rusted as the ship's hull, with rusticles dangling from them that looked like the stalactites you could find in caves. The forwardmost structure of the ship, the bridge, soon came into view, and the two subs maneuvered past it, one staying to the starboard side while the other stayed to the port. The rusted hull was dotted with shattered portholes, and the superstructure up on deck likewise had no glass. The bridge seemed intact. The walls were all still standing, though none of the windows had glass either. The submersible on the starboard side briefly turned to look at it. The doorway was open, no door was to be seen, and the inside looked like a dark cave. A small fish lazily drifted out and out of sight in the gloom. Inside the dark room was a vague shape which couldn't be identified in the gloom. It might have been part of the steering gear, or the pedestal where it had once stood. After a moment, the sub turned again and began to glide alongside the ship's upper deck towards the stern. Shortly after the bridge, the deck vanished. The ship's structure had completely caved in and collapsed into a gaping hole in the deck. The metal hull was bent and ripped open in a crevasse of collapsed doorways and fallen decks. Moving both subs down the side of the ship, the team saw that the hull on both sides was torn open in the same area. Where the ship sat, half buried in the muddy seabed, were jagged pieces of the hull jutting out like something had blasted out of the ship. It wasn't crumpled like it had collapsed upon hitting the seafloor. It looked like she exploded from inside. "What do you think?" Brock asked the man sitting to his left. The man was an expert on old ships from the region, named Andrew Dave Morrison. He had a head of white hair, was slightly overweight, wore a faded baby blue shirt, and had thinly framed glasses resting on his nose. He was gazing hard at every frame of the live feed. "Cargo ship of some kind, most likely. Judging from the bow and parts of the superstructure we can see, I'd say maybe a Dutch or British build. Probably built in either the 1930s or 1940s. He leaned forward and took more details of the superstructure in. He pointed at a specific structure. "Actually, maybe the 1920s even. From what I've seen of her body and shape, she kind of reminds me of the British steam merchant Carroll, as far as design goes, which was completed in 1919 and sank in 1941, but that's most definitely not her. She was sunk on the other side of the world. It's probably just my mind filling in the gaps based on, what I can see of her. She probably looked more like this, actually," he added, opening a laptop and going to a database of pictures, pulling up one of the Dutch freighter SS Japara taken in 1942. Probably also something sunk in World War II, Ballard suggested, and Morrison nodded. "Yeah, probably, but that damage doesn't look like a bomb was dropped on them. It looks more like they blew up from the inside." Seeing the look on Ballard's face at that comment, Morrison shook his head and added, "Well, don't get too excited now. Some of that damage definitely comes from the ship being down here for probably almost a century. Plus, if a torpedo did hit her in the right spot, it would leave that kind of damage," he said, and Ballard nodded in agreement. "Plus, she might have had a boiler explode or something too, and has had erosion eat away at her to make her look worse than it originally did. You see similar damage on almost any wreck, you know that. If the structure was damaged, that area erodes faster. Just look at the Titanic or any warship." "I want to know what this ship is. Are there any which were lost in World War II that you know of that sank in this area?" Ballard asked. Morrison shook his head. "I don't know, not off the top of my head. Like I said, it looks like a Dutch freighter from that era, likely very similar looking to the Japara, but we can't know for sure until we see the whole wreck. But a lot of freighters were sunk in the war, more than probably known about. Cargo ships were targets for obvious reasons. They didn't just carry supplies, but also troops. It would just take a Japanese plane flying overhead and a ship being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We need to look around for any features which we can match with known missing ships from the era, and if we can't find that, then features that tell us exactly what type of ship she is, at least." Brock continued staring at the damage he was seeing in the live feed and sat up abruptly. "Take the submersible back to the bow," he said. "I've got a feeling." He trailed off, and the pilots did as told, turning both subs around and following them along the sides of the ship back to the bow. "Right there. Look at that. What is that?" Ballard said, jumping out of his chair and pointing at something on the starboard side bow. A small wooden plaque was coming into view out of the gloom. If there had been one on the port side, it was gone, so both subs converged on the starboard side plaque. "Is that a nameplate?" someone asked. "It is, and it's not corroded," Ballard replied. "Well, that's because it's made of teak," the expert chimed in. Covering the nameplate was a thick layer of sediment, which rendered it unreadable, but Ballard wasn't dissuaded. "Hold the closer sub in place, right in front of it. Bring the other around and gently brush that buildup off," he ordered. Everyone watched with bated breath as the second sub crept in close and began scrubbing the grime off the teak plate. As it did, The first sub kept its lights trained on the plaque, and letters began to become visible underneath the built-up sediments as they were scrubbed away. Everyone was only able to stare in total stunned silence as the name Ourang Medan became visible, perfectly preserved on the plaque despite the hull around it rusting and rotting in the live camera feed. Ballard's antagonistic assistant threw his hands up in the air and walked out of the room. The second sub pulled back and pointed its cameras at the plaque too, showing the name of the ship clearly in both feeds. Like a haunting specter, the most famous ghost ship in history had just finally revealed herself for the first time. "I'll be goddamned," Ballard said. For the next several hours, the researchers scrambled to collect data. They couldn't get the two subs around the ship fast enough in their excitement. Ballard, in particular, was like a kid in a candy store. They didn't announce their discovery yet, only sharing to their colleagues back in the United States that they had located an undocumented, potentially historically significant wreck. Ballard chose to keep the wreck's identity a secret until they not only had fully mapped and documented it, but also swept through the surrounding area for additional debris. At the end of the expedition, Ballard was going to be presenting the findings of it to a gathering of experts in the press, with the public being able to watch the event live over the internet. They were all in for a treat even greater than they could have imagined, and Ballard could only imagine what the reaction would be when he finally did share with everyone the identity of the wreck. What are the odds of that? Finding her when we're not even looking for her was a common phrase being spread across the research ship, spoken first by an ecstatic Ballard himself. For hours, the two subs slowly worked their way around the wreck, but that massive open hole in the center of the ship yearned, and eventually, Ballard could not hold in his curiosity anymore. He'd found the ship he'd always dreamed he would find, but now he wanted to solve the mystery of her story and learn what sank her. He wanted to see deep inside the wreck. Some of the rooms in the exterior superstructure had been investigated, the bridge for example, and they'd even found the wireless room with the wireless set which sent out the infamous SOS still sitting on the bolted down table. But Ballard wanted to see the inside of the hull. One of the longest unanswered mysteries about the Ourang Medan was, if she was real, then what killed her crew? Did she have some hazardous cargo on board which was responsible? I want to see if we can't get down inside the hull. Can we get down inside the ship through that damaged section? Ballard asked 2 hours after they'd identified the ship. The lead sub was currently filming the bridge, its lights trained on an overturned locker lying rusted but intact on the floor. The sub backed out of the doorway and maneuvered towards the aft section of the wreck. The operator, he'd come up from the control room and set up in the main lab after the wreck was identified to make exploration easier, shook his head. "Maybe. You realize this ship has been down here for 90 years, right? We nudge anything inside her and the structure might collapse." Hey, we just proved one of the greatest ocean mysteries of all time did indeed occur. Now, I want to know if we can't find any clues about what killed the crew. The torn open section of the hull came into the camera view, and the sub detached an ROV down into the collapsed section. Amid the torn metal and fallen decks, one black doorway appeared near the bottom, an intact passageway which was unobstructed. "Go in, right there," Ballard said, pointing at the screen and jumping up slightly. "I'm down. I see it," the operator replied, feeling fed up already. He loved Brock, had worked with him for years, but his excitement did not make the delicate process of moving into a shipwreck easy. "It's like surgery, you have to be delicate," was how he'd always described it to himself. And to think he came up here to make communication and exploration more convenient. He urged the smaller robot forward and into the dark opening, the lights illuminating a long passageway free of blockage. "Just think," Ballard said as the ROV entered further inside and illuminated more of the passage in its lights. "We're seeing a place no one has seen for nearly a century." The ROV moved further along the corridor, the deteriorated walls still holding the ceiling up. Open doorways leading into dark rooms appeared on either side of the corridor, but the RV kept moving forward, and Ballard kept his gaze locked on the screen the feed was being sent back to. "Hey, is there access to the cargo holds on this level?" Ballard asked. One of the theories about the disaster was that the cargo had something to do with the crew's death. Could be if we're on the right deck. We are moving towards the forward sections of the ship, but with all the damage outside, I'm not sure which we're looking at exactly. This passage, though, should lead to a door, which leads to the hold if we're on the right one. And these plans continue to match up with what's down there, Morrison answered. He'd been analyzing deck plans for ships of a similar design from the same general era that this one had been built, according to his best guess. And one he was looking at seemed to line up with the outside design exactly. Now they hoped the inside would be much the same. The ROV crept deeper into the wreck. The interior of the ship seemed in relatively good condition, despite both the violent end she endured before sinking and then spending nearly a century underwater on top of that. She was certainly fragile, though, and the operator kept the ROV clear from the walls to avoid any kind of scrape or collision. There, Ballard suddenly said, jumping up and pointing at the end of the passageway, which was beginning to emerge from the gloom. There's an open hatch, and it looks like there's a big open space behind it. The operator took his hands off the ROV control for a moment in frustration, and the ROV stopped moving and lightly settled on the passageway floor, slightly stirring up the sediments. I got it, he sighed. Just relax. I get you're excited, but calm down. I don't need a coach. I got this. He urged the vehicle forward again, further down the passageway, and soon the open hatch came fully into view. Behind it was a cavern of darkness, and the end of a collapsed catwalk was visible just behind the doorway. Ballard clapped his hands and smiled. Cargo hold, baby, get in there! The ROV slowly crept forward and squeezed through the opening. The hatch was still on the hinge and swung fully open. Seeing that it was left open, Ballard turned to Morrison. Those types of hatches were watertight. Do you think if it was closed it would have kept the ship from sinking? The expert shook his head. Not if she sank as fast as the story says she did. One closed watertight hatch wouldn't make a difference with that kind of damage. They watched as the ROV moved through the open door and down into the open space, out of the claustrophobic passageway and down into the void below slowly, in case of any unseen debris that might loom out of the darkness unexpectedly. The open room of the hold was like a pitch-black void or underwater cavern, and the lights could not reach the wall, making the space feel much larger than it probably was. Some twisted, rusted metal came into view as the ROV descended, and the operator moved it aside to avoid the collapsed catwalk. The last thing they needed was the ROV to be caught on that. It would be as stuck as the Spirit rover on Mars became. As the ROV descended deeper into the gloom, into the bowels of the dead ship, the floor of the hold finally came into view. A thick layer of muddy sediment had built up on the floor, but a pile of round objects came into view. What are those? Ballard asked, pointing as the objects barely came into view on the cargo hold floor. The objects weren't buried, as the sediments had built up on the opposite side of the hold from the ones they were laying on. The operator moved the ROV to the left to shine more light on the round objects. One light directly hit them. It became obvious what they were. Barrels. Maybe some kind of chemical drums, the operator replied. Moving the ROV closer to the hold floor, it snaked its way down, and indeed the objects were revealed in its close-up lights to be rusted metal drums of some kind, toppled over, all with their lids long gone. What hold are we in? Ballard asked, turning away from the monitor. Morrison was looking at the ROV feed and paused. Well, we compare the Ourang Medan, based on what we've seen of her, to other similar Dutch cargo ships from the time. Probably cargo hold 3. It's one compartment forward of where the fire started, Ballard muttered. He looked back at the live feed on the monitor and asked, That ROV has arms, right? The operator nodded. Grab one of those barrels. I want to see if we can't find out what was in them. The operator nodded and activated the ROV's arm. He moved the robot closer and stopped just above one of the barrels and extended the claw-like hands out and grasped one of the barrels by its lip. Careful, careful, easy now, easy, Ballard urged as the operator attempted to lift the barrel up off the floor. Immediately, a bunch of sediment was kicked up, and the metal began to break apart. Forget it, stop, Ballard said, and the operator released the grasp on the barrel. The crumbling metal drum fell back to the hold floor. Try with one of the other ones, Ballard urged. The operator obliged and moved to one of the barrels on top of a small pile of others. He grasped it with the claws and began to lift. Careful, careful. Easy, easy, Ballard said. I got it, the operator assured. The drum managed to hold together as it was lifted off the pile. Okay, flip it over, Ballard said, and the operator again obliged. He flipped the barrel over and dropped it back into the pile, kicking up more sediments which needed to clear. As they did, the barrel came back into view on the camera amid the murk and floating mud, and everyone saw, amid the rust and corrosion, the faint letters stamped onto it, still clearly visible amid the rust, which read, GA, Variant B. There was a flurry of muttering around the room, shocked voices whispering to each other. Tabin, someone gasped. For the second time that day, as he stared at the possible answer to one of the most mysterious unsolved maritime mysteries in history, old letters stamped on a chemical drum that had been sitting on the bottom of the ocean for 90 years. Brock Ballard said the words, I'll be goddamned. In 1948, rumors of a ghost ship called Ourang Medan began to be spread around. The original reports were even accompanied by a supposed picture of the actual ship, showing a large, capsized freighter. No ship called Ourang Medan has ever been found in any registry. What exactly resulted in the deaths and rapid decomposition of her crew remains unknown. Some have suggested the ship was carrying an unidentified hazardous cargo, such as nitroglycerin. Today, some believe the Ourang Medan was a real but unregistered ship, or a ship with a false name, being used to transport nerve agents out of the region the Japanese controlled in World War II to the United States or Soviet Union via a method that would leave no paper trail for the other power to find. Once the shipment was lost due to an accidental release of the agent, the whole thing was covered up. If the Ourang Medan exists, its wreck has never been found. Today, many believe the story of the Ourang Medan to be nothing more than a mere urban legend.